going to start recording now. So Rebecca Mascull, thank you very much for joining us today. It's really lovely to have you here. Thank you. I wondered if you could just start. We've got, I know I've given you some questions, some advance warning of some of the questions, but I wondered if you could just start by telling us, your writing story.
Yeah.
Where did you start? When did you start? How did it happen? When did you first get published?
Yeah, well, it took a hell of a long time. So I don't know whether that's depressing or, it's just realistic, I think. It was just something I think I'd always written stories since I was a little girl. I started writing a Western when I was about 15. And then a hospital drama. And this was all because I was just copying things that I'd seen on TV and movies, and I just was always enthralled by stories. I was a big reader, but I was also a big movie goer as well. And I think that's where a lot of my influences come from, is films as well as books, really. And then it was only really when I got to university that I started to think maybe I should take this more seriously and do a bit more work on it. And I started to write some short stories, but I was never very good at short stories, still not. It's just not my thing. And I realized that I wanted a longer form, to expand into, really. And so I started writing my first novel at university, I think, and then continued that for a few years. But then I became a school teacher, which is just completely all-consuming. And I did that for several years. And then I realized that if I really wanted to do a master's in writing, but I didn't have time when I was a full-time teacher. So I saved up, and eventually I ended up doing that master's part-time and teaching part-time. And that was really when I started to think, I'm going to make my writing career plan A instead of plan B. You know what I mean? That it wasn't going to be, oh, if only I had the time and, I would do this, I would write that. It was like, well, stop making excuses and do it then. So at that time, I didn't have any kids or a mortgage or anything. So I was quite well sort of set up to live cheaply and work part-time, and that's what I did. I did it on my own, and did what I could, and got my master's in 2005 after 3 years. And I did write a novel for that. That was the first novel that I wrote. And then over the next 7 years, I was then writing 2 more novels, and all 3 of those novels I sent out to agents, and I did get 3 agents. I got 1 for each novel, but none of them ever came to any sort of publishing contract. So it was my 4th novel, which ended up being The Visitors, which I've got here, that ended up getting the publishing contract. But that whole period from leaving full-time work in 2001 and starting my master's to getting my first publishing contract was 11 years. So it was a long time. And even then, I was writing literary fiction at that time, and great reviews and lovely things that people said about the book, but it doesn't make much money unless you're very lucky. So for several years I did write literary fiction, and then in 2016 I became a single mum, and I knew that I had to earn more money, and I changed to saga writing because I wanted to try and earn some more money, and so that's when Molly Walton was born, which started off with this book here, The Daughters of Ironbridge. And that was really just a discussion with my agent. I changed agents at that time because I felt I needed a sort of fresh start. I needed a new outlook. I needed someone who was a business person, really, which is relevant to all you guys. It's just, I needed to make money. This wasn't just a hobby for me. This was my career, and I needed to make more money for me. Otherwise, I'd have to stop writing, really, because it takes so much time, as you all know, it takes a long time to write a novel, and especially historical. So I needed to make more money. So I said to this new agent, as I was talking to lots of different agents, and I said to her, what's your vision for my career? Like, because I need to make more money. And she said, well, if you want to make more money, then you should write saga. I didn't even really know what saga was. I was pretty ignorant about it. I read Catherine Cookson when I was younger and watched all of those dramas they made in the 90s. Do you remember? With just about every British star in existence was in one of those, and loved them. And said, is it Catherine Cookson? She was like, yeah, like go and do some reading. So I did, and I thought, yeah, I think I could do this. I think I could research it, and I just treated it a bit like an academic research essay, if you like. I just went and read loads of saga. And I used to teach media studies as well as English, and that really helped, I think, because I just analysed it as a genre. I thought, what are the conventions of this genre? How does it work? What are the ingredients that go into a good saga book? And I read a lot, and I found saga books that I thought were great and saga books that I thought weren't very good. And so I tried to work out what it was that I liked about the good ones, and what I wanted to incorporate in mine. And thus Molly Walton was born, and we got some good deals, and they got into supermarkets, which the other books hadn't. And that's where the money is. That's, really, particularly if you're writing something in genre fiction, you if you get into a supermarket, it's kind of like the holy grail, really, because it's just going to sell a lot by footfall alone. A lot of people go into supermarkets. And so, for example, one of my books went in during the pandemic, and of course, supermarkets were the only shops that were open. So it was very, very lucky, and it sold well. And that I was just very, very fortunate that it happened to get in. And at a time also that lots of people were sitting at home wanting to read a book as well. So, it's just, I needed, a commercial arm of my career, if you like. I still wanted to write literary fiction, but I just knew that I wasn't going to make a lot of money from it. So in order to be able to carry on writing, I needed to write something that was just going to shift more books and sell more books. And that's what saga's done for me. But even with the saga industry, it's very up and down over the years. Some books will do well, some won't. Some will get into supermarkets, some won't. It's so random. So I'm always looking out for ways to increase my revenue streams, if you like. So that's where the idea of writing a rom-com came in. So a couple of years ago, I had about 6 months off, not off, but spare, because one of my saga books was delayed in publication by about 6 months. So I said to my agent, she said, go and have a rest because you never stop working. And I said, yeah, but I'm thinking about writing something contemporary because I think it will be quicker to write. What do you think? And she said, well, everybody wants rom-coms. So I said, oh, I love rom-coms. I love rom-com movies. When Harry Met Sally is one of my favorite films of all time. And so I thought, well, maybe I can do with rom-coms what I did with saga, just go and research it, work out what are the conventions, what makes it funny. And funnily enough, during the pandemic, I'd spent a lot of time on Facebook, as I think a lot of us did. And I was dating at the time. I was single at the time and dating during the pandemic, which was insane because you just lived in this online world of madness. So I started putting posts up on Facebook. I don't know if you and I were Facebook friends then, but Lucy, but
yes, I see your posts. Yeah,
right, yeah. I mean, and the response was huge, and people were messaging me and saying you should write a book on dating because it's so hilarious. It's just comedy gold. Because the weirdness of it, just how bizarre people are, and it's just so funny. And so I thought, well, maybe I should then. So I started taking a few notes, and then I said to my agent when she said rom-coms, I said, what about a rom-com about a woman in her 50s who's dating? And she said, great, yeah, I love it. So we went away, we brainstormed a lot, we got some ideas, and and we got a deal. So it's coming out in about 2 weeks. So again, and I really enjoyed it. It was really fun, but it was much harder than I thought it was going to be. You know, never believe people when they say one genre is easier than another. It just isn't at all. It's so hard to be funny. It's just so hard to sit down and be funny. Like especially if you're having a crappy day or something. Whereas with all my historical books, they're all very serious and they've got a lot of tragedy in them. And it's often it's an escape for me to go into that tragedy, if you like. Because I always think, well, my life's better than that, like at least I'm not, down a coal mine in, the 19th century, or at least I'm not in the Warsaw Ghetto, or, whatever it is, or in a battle on a ship in 1750 or whatever. But with contemporary and comedy, it's a whole other skill, and I've learnt loads by doing it. It seems to be well received so far. It hasn't come out yet, but it's got some good reviews on NetGalley. So I'm thinking, well, and it was a 2-book deal, so I've got to write another one. So hopefully there'll be a future in that. But for me, it's all about being able to earn a living, and I don't mean that in a kind of, it's commercial because it has to be, because otherwise I can't afford the time to write. I'm not independently wealthy. I don't have a rich husband, so I have to make my living from what I do. And as I said, writing takes up so much time that it has to pay. So I would love to, spend 5 years writing the next great British novel. And maybe I could if I had 5 years, but I don't. Maybe if I make lots of money one day, I'll be able to do that. But it's not really an ambition of mine, because I just love writing, so I don't really mind what I'm writing. So there's a movie I think it's from the 90s, called Shadowlands. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It's a beautiful movie about C.S. Lewis. Yeah. And there's a funny little bit in that where he has his American lover over for Christmas, and she's got her little boy there, and the little boy says, "Are we going to have cranberry sauce?" And the very British cook in the house says, like, "What's cranberry sauce?" She's never heard of it, because this is sort of post-war, Oxfordshire. And she says, "Well, if you get me some cranberries, I'll sauce them." And I always remember that, because that's kind of how I feel about my writing career. You give me some cranberries, I'll sauce them, whether it's saga or rom-coms or whatever. And I don't mean that in a flippant way at all. I'm not saying, oh, genre fiction, anyone can do it. It's not like that at all. And there are certain genres that I think I would probably avoid, because I just don't think I've got the right brain for it. I think you just have to have a certain type of way of thinking to write certain genres. But so far I've found historical and rom-coms have suited me, and who knows, there might be some other genres that suit me, and maybe I'll go down that road, but only if it makes me the money that I need, and but even saying that, with having to make it commercial, for me it's always about writing the most quality book that I can write in the time that I've got. And whatever I'm writing, whether it's a rom-com or a historical tragedy or whatever, I just want it to be the best book that I can write. And my editors have always felt the same, and have encouraged me and helped me to do that too, and so has my agent. So I like to think I write good books, but I write a real range of different types of books, and I enjoy that, and it makes life interesting. So yeah, that's me really. That's very sort of quick potted history, but just to add to that the years before, between doing my master's and getting my first publishing contract was, those sort of 12, 11 years were pretty difficult to get through without, any publishing contracts. There were lots of rejections. I mean, in the hundreds, Wow. Every time I sent a book out to an agent, I sent to a minimum of 50 agents. And all of them except one said no on every occasion. And then with each of those agents, the first one just sort of disappeared. The second one sent it out to about 20 publishers. The third one sent it out to about 20 or 30 publishers, and they all said no. So that was sort of 11, 12 years of my life that was really, really hard. And there were many times where I just thought, what am I doing? You know, this is a complete waste of time. And I nearly gave up many times. But I don't know, it was like, I knew that I could do it, and I knew that there were enough signs, if you like, along the path where people were saying, this is good, you know, like, this is really good and you should keep going. And there were enough people of influence, if you like, saying that along the journey that made me carry on. And you know, I got there, but you know, once you get published and you feel that's it, I've got published, it's all hooray, you know, forever. And then they shift the goalposts, you know, and then it's like, yeah, you've got that deal, but then will you get another deal? And will you get the same amount of money that you got last time? Probably not. So then there's all these other goalposts. So it's never easy. It's always a battle, but I don't really want to do anything else. You know, I mean, I was a good teacher, and I will teach if I need to, but I'd much rather be writing a book.
Oh, that's a really great story, Becca, in itself. You probably should write that story too. But can we just dive in kind of at the end in a way, because there was one question that came in, I think it was from you, Gina, about pseudonyms. And you've now got 3 pseudonyms. Well, you've got your own name and you've got 2 pseudonyms. What's the kind of, what would have happened if you'd written them all under your own name, or what's the advantage and the disadvantage?
But it's not really my choice as such. It's more the marketplace that dictates that. So I think the way to think about it is branding. They're all different brands. And this should be very easy for you guys as business experts. You know, they're just different brands. So you know, when someone goes into a supermarket and sees a small selection that they've got there, they will be able to make a beeline for the type of book that they like. You know, some people will read all sorts of different genres. Some people will only read one type of genre. You know, it's a real mixture. So book covers and titles, and yes, even author names are part of that branding. And you need to be able to get across to the reader in a split second, really, everything you can about the genre of the book, the likely kind of story, the kind of style. Because I think it was an editor of mine said to me once that the average amount of time that a person looks at a book cover in a bookshop is about 1 second. So in that 1 second, you've got to get all that information across. So branding is massively important in the book world. And the Rebecca Mascull brand, which had been sort of developed with Hodder and Stoughton, which was my first publisher, was you know, literary fiction of a very particular type. It was all about young women who were within history but had done something unusual within history, and that kind of became the Rebecca Mascull brand. And then when I moved to Saga and discussed this with my agent at length, she said, I think that we should send it in as a new brand, as a new Saga writer, because publishers love a debut. So what it then became was actually an opportunity to reinvent yourself as a debut. And I felt a bit weird about this at first, because I sort of said, well, I'm not a debut. Isn't that like lying? You know, like, I've been doing this game for a while. But she said, you know, but you're a debut in the Saga world. So I was like, well, as long as they say that. And I remember like making sure that it said that on Amazon. It said, this is her debut Saga novel, because I didn't want to kind of lie, you know. But I realized this is so normal. Once I started talking to other writers, this happens a lot. So when it was sent out to publishers to look for a deal for, and this was for the Ironbridge Saga, was the first. I've got all my books here because I thought I might need to refer to them. So this was the trilogy. We're all based at Ironbridge because my brother lived there, and I went on holiday there, and I thought this would make a great saga, this place, because it's basically the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. So it was just like perfect for a saga story. So, and Ironbridge was just such a great name, and I just thought that would be so good in a title, you know. And so she was about to send it out that day to publishers. And what we'd done is we'd done a synopsis of the trilogy, and I'd written the opening of the first book. That's all. I hadn't written a whole novel because I was working full time at the time and just didn't have time. So she said, well, we'll see if we can get a deal on that. And then she just said, well, you know, have you got a name for this saga writer? And I was like, no. So she said, well, think one up, because you know, we need to send this out. So I just thought, well, what's a saga writer's name? You know, so I just thought, wow, maybe think of something old fashioned. So how about my grandparents' names? So that's what I did. So it's my maternal grandmother's first name was Molly with an IE. And then my paternal grandmother's maiden name was Walton. And I thought the Waltons as well, that was a saga, and it's kind of, you know, old timey, and you know, and they both had 2 syllables, they both got L's in the middle, they just kind of seemed to go nicely on a book cover, you know, and we just, oh, that sounds like a saga writer, let's send it off. So what I didn't know actually was she didn't tell any of the publishers who I was, so she didn't say this is from Rebecca Maskell, author of blah blah. She just said we've got this new great new saga by Molly Walton. So when we finally got the deal with, and it was with Bonnier Zaf, they said, who is this Molly Walton? You know, and then she could go, actually, it's, you know, Rebecca Maskell. So that was really nice that I actually got the deal on the strength of the material and not my name or previous sales or whatever. And Molly Walton was born, you know, so there she is. And they liked the name and they kept it, but quite often, you know, publishers will change that. When it came to, well, they might change it because they might just feel it doesn't suit the space, you know, suit the genre or whatever. And then when it came to the rom-com, that was just from the beginning, we discussed it as to what would be the best sounding name. And there were long discussions about the surname. So the rom-com is, eventually it's Harper Ford. I just really like the name Harper. I just thought I mean, you know, it sounds really naff, but I just thought it sounded cool. I just liked it. And it kind of sounded a bit American as well. And you know, I was hoping that maybe it would come out in America. And, you know, it was just a nice name. I thought it was a cool name. It was an interesting name. But oh my goodness, you wouldn't believe the long-ranging discussions that we had about the surname, getting the surname right. And then in the end, I wanted Ford, and I just put my foot down and I said, yeah, that's what I want. So I just like it's easy to spell. See, these are the sort of things you have to think about. Is it going to fit on a book cover nice and easily? Is it easy to spell? Is it easy to Google? Right? I mean, these are things you need to think about. Is it easy to find? And is there anyone else who's writing under this name that's going to get confused if if someone Googles it? So funnily enough, Harper James was the first name we used, and then we found out there was another rom-com author called Harper James, just by bad luck, who wrote very erotic books. And we were like, maybe we don't particularly want to be, mixed up with this other Harper James, not because, I mean, I'm sure her books are fantastic, but just because we didn't want people to get confused between the two. So you might actually see online somewhere, if you look up Divorce Not Dead, you might find the odd reference to a Harper James that's still on there, because that's how it originally went up online. And then we had all these discussions, and we decided on Ford in the end. And they were happy with that, and we were happy with that as a brand. And that's really a very long-winded way of us answering your question, sorry. But yeah, that's how it comes about. So you just got to think of it like brands, like Pepsi, Coke, McDonald's, whatever, Disney, whatever it is, they all have a certain kind of feel to them, a mood to them, a place in the marketplace, and certain expectations. If you're going to read
really
a Molly Walton book,
I don't know if any of us realized that so much went into the author's name and the and using a pseudonym and things. That's so maybe don't use your own name if it's not right for your brand.
What? I kind of wish now that I've sort of been involved in social media for a long time, and how easy it is for weird people to find you and get in touch with you. I kind of wish that I didn't use my real name at all, and that I kept that kind of to myself, and I just used author names for everything, but that's hindsight, and hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I don't really mind. But everyone who knows me calls me Becca, so what I tend to do now is on social media I differentiate between the me is Becca, if you like, and then Rebecca is the author name, if you see what I mean. So some of my social media is called Becca Maskell, and that generally will talk about all of my books. Whereas for Harper Ford, we set up an Instagram just for her. And I've got a Facebook page for Molly Walton as well. So I've got some specific channels that are just for those people. But if you see Becca, that's like me, if you know what I mean. That's the name behind all of it. Yeah.
Well, that just shows you how much work you have to do on social media as well. If you've got three personas that you've got to keep going, that's a lot of work.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah. Karen, do you want to start asking your historical author questions? Because that's a whole other.
Sure.
Oh, you're still muted. Sorry.
I was just saying thank you, and that was fascinating. I didn't know any of that. So my mind's now going, what could I call myself?
Yeah. Well, you don't have to. You can keep your own name. Yeah. And I mean, a lot of people like that. You know, they want people to know who, you know, they went to school with or they used to work with. You know, they want those people to know that they've become a novelist now or whatever. So, you know, it's completely up to you. But I think it, you know, for me, it happened by accident in the sense that I was writing a different genre. So that's why it wasn't really a choice. It just kind of came with the territory.
I read The Seamstress of Warsaw, which I just thought was amazing. Lovely book. So thank you. But one of my questions was, I'm just disappearing down a massive hole of research, and you read one thing, it leads to something else, and so my two main questions really was, when do you decide that's enough? Because obviously The Seamstress of Warsaw was, well, I assume was pretty accurate and based on some, you know, some real life events, and that kind of shone through. But you know, that can kind of, like, you could easily spend 5 years researching something of that nature. So when do you decide, right, that's enough? And then my other question was, how do you always make your fictional elements of your story fit the facts, or do you bend the facts for the sake of the story? You know, how true or not are you to history?
Those are excellent questions. Certainly, you know, I can see from the questions those are writers' questions. You know, these are the sort of things that historical writers have to think about. Absolutely. The honest answer on the enough research question is that once you start writing to contracts, it's all about time. So you know, you have a deadline and you have to fit your work into that deadline. You have to be able to do your research, then plan your novel. Well, this is the way I do it because I'm a real planner. I think that's another question we might discuss at some point, but I'm a massive planner. But that's because I've started off writing historical novels. I think it's just the way my brain works anyway, but also I just find when you're trying to fit your fictional characters into a historical backdrop, especially something like World War II with The Seamstress of Warsaw, you know, certain events happened at certain times and you can't really mess with that, or you mess with that at your peril, you know. So especially if it's a big event, you know, you can't get away with changing the date of D-Day, can you? You know, someone's going to notice. So, but even with some things like the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, for example, you know, I know when that happened, and I don't want to mess around with that if I don't have to. So this kind of, you know, blends into your second question as well about how do you know, whether I bend the facts or not. I really try hard not to. I'm just a real stickler. I'm a pedant in my head, mostly. I try not to you know, be a pedant in real life with real people. But, you know, if I watch a movie or I read a book and there's an anachronism, it really bugs me, you know, and I will be the most annoying person in the room, you know, and I'll turn to my partner and I'll go, well, actually, you know, this happened in, you know, June 1937, not May, you know, and he'll just be like, you know, but that's me. That's the way my brain works. I want them to get this stuff right. And that's how I feel about my own writing. So if they're, for the purposes of the story, and this is what you find when you've got a plot and you're inserting your plot then into, you know, a historical framework, that sometimes you might have to shift the odd thing around just to make the story work. And it hasn't happened that much with me because I tend to research first and then plan the story. So I generally have the historical framework there already, and then I'll try and plan the story around that, you know. So the way I see it, I kind of have this real world setting, and then I take my fictional characters a bit like chess pieces, you know, and I kind of place them within that historical setting. So I try and make their stories fit, you know, what else is happening at the time. So in Seamstresses of Warsaw, you've got characters who are moving from the Blitz to the Warsaw Ghetto to the forest partisans, and the, you know, and the Russians coming in to liberate Poland. So that's your sort of time span. And so I wanted my characters to move through that time span and have certain experiences. And so I researched all of that first and then developed my story as I researched. So funnily enough, that particular example, that was the third novel that I wrote that wasn't published originally. So way back in, I started writing when my daughter was born, and so that was 2007. So it was written, or the initial planning and research for it was written a long time ago. And then much more recently, I came back to it because my agent was keen on it as well. And we got a deal much more recently, but that was a hell of a lot of rewriting, and we had to edit a lot down because it was much longer and that sort of thing. But because that was written before I got published, I had all the time in the world to research it, and I did. I had a bit of money from a relative's will, and I left work for a year, and I researched the Seamstress of Warsaw like every day for a year.
Wow.
So I must have read about 100 texts, like no joke. I mean, about at least 100. I've got them all in the garage. I saw them the other day. I just thought, must write another book using those books because they're just sitting there gathering dust. But you know, it was my first historical novel that I ever wrote, so I just assumed that I had to know everything, and that's how I approached it as a task. I just thought, well, you need to know everything about World War II. I soon realized that was just literally impossible to know everything about World War II, because you could research World War II until the end of your life and never know all of it. It's just endlessly complex. So then I realized, okay, well, I need to know everything about Poland in World War II, and then realized that was too big. And even the Holocaust was too big, you know, and really what I needed to know was the very specific things that my characters were going to be doing. But I don't regret any of that other research that I did before, because what it allows you to do is understand the universe that you're, you know, creating and that you're putting your characters in. And it gives you, it's their milieu, you know, it's their setting, it's their values, it's their upbringing that may not even be mentioned in the novel, but you understand it. And I think when you come to start writing it, you will have that depth of understanding of where these people are coming from, that may just kind of come out subconsciously in some of the things they say or do. But you know, a reader, personally, I feel like the research should be as invisible as possible, so the reader's not thinking, oh, well, I can see they know a lot about this, you know, because once a reader starts thinking that, then you let them pull themselves out of the story, you know. And I think the worst historical novels are the ones where you feel like you're reading a lecture, you know, because it's supposed to be a story. It's a story that happens to be set in a different time and place, but it should be about what good stories are about, you know, about love, loss, pain, tragedy, you know, all of those things. That's what the story is about. It just happens to be set in the Warsaw Ghetto or whatever. But of course, you've got to get your facts straight. So I suppose in a very roundabout way, the answer to your question is, how do you know when it's enough? Well, with that particular example, I had filled a certain number of notebooks, you know, and I just felt like my brain was kind of vibrating with it, you know, like I just felt it had reached a critical mass whereby I was then able to just sit down and go, you know, like I was just ready. I was like, you know, at the starting gate, like eager. I was like, I really want to start writing now, you know, like I have enough research now. and also then having the confidence to think, if I don't know something as I'm going along, I'll just go and look it up. It's not a problem. But lots of writers are very, very different. Funnily enough, I went to the Hay Festival about 20 years ago, and I saw Margaret Atwood, who was one of my heroes. And I put my hand up and I got to ask a question of Margaret Atwood, which was just like one of the best moments of my life. And I asked her that exact question. I asked her about research. How do you do your historical research? How do you, know when you've done it and blah, blah, blah. And she was a complete opposite to me. She said, I just start writing and then I do my research as I go along. And I just thought, oh no, I'm doing it wrong. Because I thought, oh, if Margaret Atwood doesn't do it that way, then I must be wrong. But I knew that is the way that I had to do it for my brain. My brain, I felt I needed to know the setting first before. But it again, the research will lead you down rabbit holes, as you say. And some of those are fruitless. Some of them you'll be like, you know what, I don't need to know that. But other rabbit holes turn out to be incredibly fruitful. So, for example, in the Seamstress of Warsaw, there's a whole section with the forest partisans in eastern Poland where they set up a village in the forest that was a village of Jewish people who'd all escaped from the Nazis. And they lived out the whole war in the forest. And this is true. And I stumbled on this by accident by a book that happened to be in a bookshop under the Holocaust. And it was called the Bielski Brothers, I think, or it was called Defiance or something like that. And I just started reading it and I thought, oh my goodness, this is an amazing story. Like, I just want my character to go to this forest and meet these people. So that was just luck, but it actually worked really nicely because you had kind of Act 1 was the Blitz, Act 2 was the ghetto and the revolt, and then Act 3 was in the forest. So it actually worked really nicely as a story, and that's why that happened. So that particular rabbit hole ended up being a major part of the story. So I wouldn't be too sort of strict with yourself. If you find yourself going down a rabbit hole and it's really interesting, then pursue it for a little while, because it may end up changing your story completely, and that's great, and trust that your subconscious knows when something's interesting. When you get excited, when you read something and you thought, I didn't know that, what is this? This is fascinating. And that might not be part of your original plan, but go with it and just follow it along and see where you get to, because sometimes that will be a much better story than the one that you had in mind, and that's fine. And that's your subconscious talking to you and telling you this is more interesting than other rubbish that you're going to write, so you're like, okay, well, let's go along here for a while and see what we come up with. So that that might expand your research beyond, especially if we've got a deadline. Those things are annoying. It's like, oh god, I'm going a week behind now because I've been reading all this other stuff about this, but it's much more interesting. So but if you end up changing your story, then so be it. In terms of bending the facts, I mean, I've kind of answered that a bit, but also I would just say what I've tended to do is most of my novels is write an author's note at the back. So all of the Mascull novels have an extended author's note, and you'll probably notice they get longer and longer in the first 3, because what I noticed was when I wrote The Visitors, when hardback came out, I got some reviews which said, well, I was enjoying this book until it got to the bit in the Boer War where the character was writing these long letters with military maneuvers and all these details, and that was ridiculous, and that never happened. No one would allow that to happen in the army, and they would have been censored, and it was ridiculous and stupid. So I stopped reading, and I was tearing my hair out because I'd researched the Boer War in great detail. I'd spoken to an expert at one of the London universities about the Boer War, and had found out that it was the last war that Britain was involved with that didn't have widespread censorship of letters. And also, a lot of those letters were lost on their way to Britain by the rail lines being sabotaged by the Boers and things like that. So a lot of them were lost on their way to being sent and then found again and sent. So it was perfectly possible that these letters would have got through. And I know that because I went to the Imperial War Museum and I read letters from people in the Boer War. So, and I read whole letters that had all of this detail in. So I thought, well, I can write letters like that because this, you know, has historical precedent. And it really bugged me. And I said to my editor, what can I do about this? And she said, don't answer them. Don't ever answer readers online. It's like de rigueur. You don't do it. You must never do it. So I was like, but that's so unfair. And she was like, just don't. Just don't ever get into those arguments. She said, but what you could do is do a blog post about it. So I did. I was on Tumblr at the time, and I did a blog post about, just in case you might be interested, here's some information about letters in the Boer War. And it's directed at that annoying person who's written that review, you know, without saying that. And then she said, also, why don't you mention it in the author's note? So in the, you'll notice if you've got the hardback and the paperback of the Visitors, the author's note is much longer in the paperback, because when that came out 6 months later, I'd had the chance to rewrite the author's note and put more information in it. So when I started writing my second published novel, which was Song of the Sea Maid, I already knew about this, obviously, because I'd had that experience. So I started writing the author's note as I started writing the novel. So I actually started keeping information about, so I remember things like there's a scene where they're in London and there are dolphins swimming up the Thames. And I just thought some idiot will say, dolphins never swam up the Thames in the 18th century, you know, and I just thought, well, they did actually, because I read it, you know, in 2 different books about the 18th century. So I've got, you'll see that it's a really long answer. And basically it's me just going, no, you know, to all the people that might say that never happened, you know. And the same with The Wild Air, which is about a female pilot, you know, before the First World War. And loads of people are like, well, this is really, you know, this never happened, did it? Well, yes, you know, it did. Not everything she did happened, but it could have happened. And that's my basic rule about historical fiction. It didn't happen necessarily, but it could have happened. So I just feel like if I've got precedent, if I can see something that's very similar to what I'm trying to write, and at least 2 sources, which is what I try to get, so that you know it wasn't just a one-off or a lie. That you know, I feel like I have license then to put it in. But you know, it is fiction. So that's always my get out clause, you know, like it is a novel. So you have to have that willing suspension of disbelief, and some people will have that and some people won't. But with my sagas, I'm exactly the same. I research in just the same way. You know, there's a lot of literary snobbery out there about genre fiction, that it's not as good as literary fiction. And I think that's bollocks, excuse my language. But I work just as hard on my sagas as I do on my literary fiction, and make sure that the historical research is just as thorough. So I'm writing a World War II saga at the moment, and you know, I'm just about to start learning about lumberjills in the Scottish forests, and you know, all this stuff. And you really have to do your research. And saga readers are so knowledgeable about their subjects. They read so many books on these subjects. And someone will catch you out if you bullshit your way through your historical research. So you really do need to make that effort. So, you know, the sort of easy answer to your question is you will know when there's enough research. I think that's really the
No, that's amazing. Can I just, you said about timescales.
Oh.
So if you take a concept and it gets accepted by a publisher, presumably like just a plot outline or summary,
yeah.
How long do you get typically to write it?
It's very different depending on different publishers. Some publishers want you to write 2 books a year. Some are okay with 1 book a year. Recently I've done 2 in a year, but generally it's been one a year. So, but when you say a year, it's not a year, because you're editing the last one at the same time. You know, so you'll be editing that. So once you hand it in, you know, your editor will look at it and they'll do their edit. But then the editing process takes, I don't know, about 6 months roughly, because it goes to 3 different editors. So you've got your main editor will do a structural line edit, then it goes to a copy editor, and then it goes to a proofreader. So that, you know, and then it's coming back to you in between, you know, all the way. So that takes, you know, several months. Meanwhile, you're starting your next one. So from the date you've handed in your last one, then you've got a year to give in the next one. So you can see it's 6 months of that taken with editing the last one. You can't then go, oh, can I have a year now, please? You know, because 6 months have gone. So during that 6 months, that's when I'm then researching for the next one at the same time as editing. You're always, as a jobbing writer, you're always doing several things at once, you know. So I'll be researching for a few months and then planning and then starting the writing. I'm a very fast drafter. It's just the way that I write. I draft extremely quickly, but that's because I plan so much in advance as well. So I don't write and research as I go along, like Margaret Atwood said she did. I do a lot of the research and planning first. My plans are extremely detailed. They're generally about 10,000 words, my plans. So, you know, by the time I start to actually sit down and write, I've got a 10,000 word plan that is there, you know, that details every single chapter. And it's a chapter plan. It's literally chapter by chapter what is going to happen. And what if I have time, what I try and do is type up my research and then literally copy and paste my research into that chapter plan as well, so that all the research is there. But these days I'm writing so many books at once, I don't actually have time to do that anymore. So what I tend to do is I just have the research notes beside me while I'm writing, and then, you know, I'll be looking things up and sort of, you know, doing it on the fly if you like. But yeah, I mean, sometimes you are being asked to write a full historical 100,000 word novel in 6 months. That's from conception, research, planning, and writing, drafting, and final draft in 6 months. And it's a
and
big
what's the sort of typical word length? Are you given a maximum or a minimum, or?
Yeah, it usually says in your contract, so it's usually around 100k, but some of them will say 80k, 90k. It's usually around that. Yeah.
Is it longer for historical novels or sagas than it is for, say, the rom-com?
No, I don't think so. I think one of my saga contracts said 80, but I tend to write a bit long anyway. My first drafts are always really short because I tend to underwrite. And then my editors have got used to me over the years that they need to draw it out a bit, because I just tend to sort of vomit my first draft. It's like, sorry for that horrible allusion, but it is a bit like that. I'm just like, you know, I talked about that critical mass. It's kind of like when my head's buzzing and I'm like, right, go. And then I just like might write the whole thing in, say, you know, 3 months. And it comes out very fast. And it's like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, you know. And so my editor's job is to go like, whoa there, you know, like you've got this scene here, which is really important, and you've like skipped over it in 2 paragraphs, you know, but you know that this is a goodbye scene between 2 main characters and this needs a whole chapter, and you know that, so get on with it, kind of thing. And my editors are kind of used to me doing that now, that I will be like, okay. And I'll go back and I'll rewrite it properly. But that, you know, I've got so little time to write as well that I feel like my first draft is more like a skeleton, you know, and it's like the second and third drafts are like where I put more flesh on the bones. But and that's not usually the research that's added in. It's usually just the story itself, the narratives, the scenes that are needed to really grab the reader. So yeah, but you know, in today's publishing world, people want the next book very quickly. In fact, my when I first signed with Welbeck for this most recent saga, which is the World War II one, you might have seen these ones, the Ravenhall ones with the gorgeous girls on the covers. They wanted 2 books a year when I first signed that contract. And I just thought, oh my God, you know, what am I going to do? But as it turned out, it was delayed. The second book was delayed. And now all of my next contract is all 1 book a year, which I'm much happier with. But then you get paid later, you know, so it all depends. But then because I'm writing rom-coms as well at the moment, I'm writing 2 books a year. So that works very well for me. So
interesting. Yeah. Mary, that sort of ties in with your question about showing and telling. And
yes, yeah.
Do you want to kind of ask that?
Well, Becca, I think you've answered a bit of it. I mean, just a comment and a reflection now before I go into it, which is when you think about how many bad books get on the market, you think when somebody writes as well as you, why does it make you work so hard to get out there? But, you know, that's just a comment, really. Because there's a lot of but there's a lot of really rubbish or really bad fiction. I've come up with quite a bit of it myself, and thinking,
oh, surely not.
Especially in my coming of age and fantasy genres, which is what I read extensively because that's the one I'm in. But anyway, so I think it really it builds on what Karen was asking, and you've actually given us a bit of that, which is the one I've read is The Visitor. So there was 4 key bits that you went into quite a lot of detail with. One of them was the deaf-blind phenomenon, and taking the protagonist view of how to see the world from that, and then all of the thing around sign writing, which was amazing. Then it was the hop farming and all of the details around the hop farming. Then it was oyster farming, and then it was the Boer War. So it was like, I was amazed at how much depth of facts were in there, but at no point did I feel I was sitting there and having a lecture. It just really was very seamless, and I thought, gosh, that's quite a trick to be able to do that. And you've sort of explained a bit of it in terms of it's all buzzing in there when it comes out, but there must be more that you're conscious of that you do to help it fit in the story really well.
That's such a great question, and I think it's more by feel than anything. And a lot of it comes from having read books where that didn't happen, and I was frustrated by it, So, it's kind of horrible mentioning books that you didn't like, because I hate that I hate those Instagram posts that are like, let's talk about books that I hated. And I'm like, really? Have you got nothing better to do with your life than slag off some, writer's work? But this is more about taste, I think. Some people love a novel that's got, shed loads of historical research in, and they don't mind the fact that it doesn't, particularly progress the story. But because there were a couple of novels that I read, because of menopause brain, I can't even remember what they're called. So, I'm not going to slag them off, so it doesn't matter. I literally can't remember what they're called. But there was one about set in Victorian times, and it had a lot of stuff that was just fascinating, but not part of the story at all. And I just got so tired of it as I was reading it. I just thought, I mean, I knew quite a bit of it anyway, because I'd recently written a Victorian novel, and I don't know everything about Victorian times. My God, not at all. I know little slices of it, from the books that I've had to research. But I just felt, okay, but where's the character and what are they doing, and what's going to happen next? And then there was another one which was set on a pig farm in America, and I knew far more about pig farming than I ever wanted to know by the time I'd read that book. And I just thought, that just felt very much like that completely overtook the story. And we all find certain things fascinating, and I'm sure lots of people love that book, but for me, it just got boring. It's a simple fact, it just got boring. And that was very influential on me. And I thought, don't put it this way, wear your research lightly, And so I think you just get better at that, to be honest with you, as you get more experience, of writing historical fiction. You just start to realise when you're banging on about something far too long. And a good editor will also pull you up on that and say, we don't really need to know that, do we? You've kind of gone off on a tangent and you're on your little soapbox and you're saying, isn't this interesting? But it's really about, I try and see it like a movie. I think that's a good way to do it. I'm very movie influenced anyway. I write very visually, I think. So I quite often, will be imagining it as a scene. And if it's a scene, and this is what I love about screenwriting as well, and I'd love to know more about screenwriting, is that, you have certain aims that you have to get to by the end of that scene. You have to get these people over there doing this thing. So, that's how I write, really. I have to maneuver my characters into this position by the end of this scene. So it has to progress the plot to a certain point. And that's why I, plan out, because that's how my brain works. So it's just, I need it structured so that I know where my characters are going. And so if you think of it like that, suddenly you shoehorn in some massive lump of exposition or historical research, it's literally an obstacle to your characters getting past it, you know, to get to where they need to be. They don't need to know that. They live in that milieu. They don't need to know, you know, everything that you know about Victorian plumbing or whatever. But they will just throw in a comment, you know, that shows their understanding of that topic. It shows they're an expert on it or whatever, and the reader will understand it too. So you need to give enough that there's enough context so that they'll get it, but not too much so that you're banging them over the head with it, you know. So it is a balance between those two extremes. But really, I think as long as you remember that your job as a writer is to tell a good story, then you should start to get a kind of feeling when you are wandering off that path, if you like. And it can happen with description, you know, description of places, description of people, description of events, and also exposition. And I'm a real stickler about exposition, that the show don't tell thing that we were talking about before. You know, any book that starts off with 10 pages of backstory is going to lose me, you know, because I'm like, I want this story to move forward. And but again, this is personal. Everyone's different as a reader. And I might feel like, you know, I want that fed in and filtered in as we go along. Personally, to me, the best writing does that. It's not a lump of information. And you can just tell exposition when it's a lump, can't you? You know, particularly when you're watching, you know, a drama, and some character turns around and goes, well, actually, interestingly, and then they just talk for 10 minutes about some topic, and you just like fallen asleep or gone to make a cup of tea because you're so bored of this character banging on, but you want them to get on with what they're supposed to be doing. So I think that's the basic rule that I follow, is that the plot should always progress. And historical research should be there to make your characters and your story feel realistic, feel like it is set in that period, without being too obvious that you're doing that. Do you see what I mean? And unfortunately, as a historical novelist, that sometimes means that you might research for a week something that ends up being one line in your novel. And that has happened, and it's, you know, very frustrating, but it was worth it for that one line, you know, because that one line might, you know, if it wasn't there, it might be a detriment to the story. So, you know, it's a very difficult balance, and I think as you do it more, you'll just get better at it. But my general rule is, if it doesn't progress the story, it shouldn't really be there.
That's great. Gina, you wanted to ask Becca about characters.
Yes, I did. I think it follows on quite well, Becca, actually. And I've got the fact that you are a pretty good planner from the sound of things, which is not the way everybody writes necessarily. But I must say, Lucy has set us off on the write your Bible of characters kind of route. So we've all done that. But I found that as I've been writing, the characters come into life, and I completely get the scene thing. I can see the scene, and that's how I write it, and that's how it kind of comes. But I was thinking more about the personalities, because you're certainly, having read The Wild Air, you know, it's really simplistic. Actually, I don't mean that in a bad way at all. It's so endearing because it is so simple that, you know, and it's how to draw out the personalities of those. You know, you don't have that many characters necessarily, but it's just how do you get the reader to go, oh yeah, no, I really love Della, because you know, she's obviously got a love for what she loves most, you know, in being that aviatrix, and she's not wanting to show off. She just loves it. You know, she just adores it, doesn't she? And the kite link and everything. It was just so well done. But I wondered how you actually decide. Do you decide that from the beginning? Right, I'm going to make Della like this. I'm going to get Digby like this. Or does it just come through the writing? Because that's how I think it's happening with the way I'm writing it.
Again, an excellent question. It's quite hard to answer, I think, because it is quite mysterious. It isn't, for me, something that I particularly plan. Although, you know, I've certainly seen lots of creative writing activities of, you know, write character profiles and, you know, write your character Bible or whatever. And that's all very useful. I think, especially when you're starting out, it's a really useful sort of technique, you know, hot seating your characters, asking them things and interviewing them, and all of that stuff will help you to get to know your characters. And I would never discourage anyone from doing whatever they feel is necessary to get to know their characters. It's just not, I'm too impatient to do it. It's just, I love the research, but the planning for me is a more organic process. So I don't tend to make lots of notes on characters. I do have, I've kind of refined it now where I have one notebook which is all research and one notebook which is just ideas about the story. Okay, so, and that will be a massive jumble of stuff. And so any ideas that I have about the characters, usually while I'm having a shower or when I'm cooking my dinner or I'm driving, and I will, like, you know, record it on my phone or something so that I don't forget it. It'll be character points like that. You know, Della will do this, or she was really into fixing her bike because that's how her brain works, you know, because she's a mechanic. So, you know, that's why she loves aircraft engines, you know, and that kind of thing. And the Wright brothers were bicycle designers, so that makes sense. You know, it'd be little things like that will just pop into my head and I'll write that down. But generally, I feel like these characters are already residing in my subconscious. And I know it sounds a bit waffy, but that's kind of how I feel about them. And it's a bit like the idea that, you know, there was a block of stone, and inside that block of stone was Michelangelo's David, you know, and he found it in that block of stone. He chipped away until he found it. And that's kind of how I feel about fictional characters, that we chip away until we find them. And particularly with historical, I found once you start doing the research, a character will start to shape themselves around what you're reading. So I'm glad you read The Wild Air, because that's the first one that popped into my head when I saw that question, was that how did Della come to be? Well, the first two novels that I'd written were these two, Song of the Sea Maid and The Visitors. And both of them, even though one of them was actually deaf and blind and couldn't speak, both of them were incredibly gobby, as I like to call them, really real chatterboxes, you know. And they both, because of that, they both came to me in first person and they were chattering away. And in fact, I remember standing in the kitchen making a cup of tea, and Liza from The Visitors just started talking to me, literally was talking to me in my head. And the first line of the novel just popped into my head. My name is Adeliza Golding. I am born breech and I nearly killed mother. That just came to me in the kitchen. I was like, oh my God, I'll write that down. You know, and she just started talking to me. And Song of the Sea Maid, she just started talking to me as well, because I started trying to write her in the third person and it just was flat on the page. I wrote sort of several pages in third person and I just thought, oh, this is awful. And then I just had a sort of thought, well, maybe I should try first person present tense, but I'd done that with The Visitors as well. And I thought, maybe I shouldn't do the same for my second book. And I was overthinking it, you know, and actually I just should have listened. So my subconscious was kind of knocking on the door saying, this girl wants to tell you her story. So I just listened, and she just started talking to me. She was outside this pie shop. Her brother was getting this brick out of the wall so that they could climb through and steal a pie. And that's where my character wanted to be and what she wanted to tell me. So I just listened and I started writing it down as if she was dictating it to me, you know. Then I came to The Wild Air and I thought, I've got this fiction writing thing sorted, you know, I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm just going to wait, you know, while I'm doing my research for Della to kind of turn up and start talking to me. And I waited and I waited and she never started talking to me. And I thought, oh no, you know, I've lost the muse, you know, what am I going to do? And I just sort of carried on researching. And I was interviewing pilots at that time. I interviewed a female aerobatic pilot champion, amazing woman. Interviewed her, interviewed a couple of other pilots who fly vintage planes as well. And I started to get a feel for what the ideal pilot personality was like. And what I realized was that pilots were incredibly observant people. they had to be really calm in any sort of, you know, panicky situation, any emergency, because it was life or death, literally. So you couldn't be a really kind of adventurous kind of show off as what you might imagine the early pilots would be. You actually had to be really scientific, really mathematical, really clinical, and never lose your cool, because then you would be dead, you know. So I started to get a feel of what a good pilot was like. And I realized that Della was not a chatterbox like the other two. She was observant. She was cool, calm, and collected. She was one of life's watchers, and also a doer. You know, it's all actions, not words for her. She watches things, she learns stuff, she tries it with her hands, and then she does it. You know, she doesn't talk about it. And that's why she wasn't talking to me. So then I thought, right, I need to just start going inside her head and looking at what she's looking at. And I started writing in the third person, but it was all third person limited viewpoint. So it's all in her head. We don't see anything that other characters see, just what she sees. And so you've still got that first person feel about it, but there's no way that Della Dobbs would sit down and talk to you for 100,000 words. You know, she'd be off, you know, fixing a bike or something. So I needed to get inside her head, but she wasn't going to be doing any of the talking. So her character came out of the nature of being a pilot and what I was learning about that kind of person who would be good at what she did, because she had to be better than the best men at what she did because of the sexism at the time. You know, she was just laughed, you know, women were laughed off the field when they try to, you know, get an airplane and fly. So she had to be really, really good at what she did. So I had to make her the kind of ideal pilot. And this was what I was learning about, that they had that kind of personality. Now, I'm not saying there aren't chatty pilots out there. And in fact, the chap, Rob, who took me flying and is now a dear friend, who I found through my research, he's one of the chattiest people you'll ever meet. I mean, he rivals me for chattiness, and that's saying something. But it's just this kind of way of approaching, you know, a situation of utter calm and observant and very good with their hands that made her not a natural storyteller. Whereas the first two were, you know, Liza and what's her name, Dawnay, from the other two books, were very, very chatty, and that's just the way they were. And they got what they wanted through persuading people through their communication. And obviously, the first book is all about communication because she's deaf and blind and she's learning sign language. And the second one, she's an orphan, she's poor, and she wants to travel the world and be a scientist. So she has to persuade people. She has to talk people into giving her what she needs. So she's very, very persuasive, very clever about, you know, persuading people to do what she wants. Della's not interested in any of that. She just wants to fly. So that all came through the research, came through the writing. And I just feel like these people form themselves, and I have to listen to that. I think what's happening is that they're forming in my subconscious, and my subconscious always knows better. So I listen to it. So I think, you know, you're saying that you're already getting those characters coming. Well, listen to that. Don't try and, I know I'm using this phrase before, but shoehorn. It's a really good phrase. It's very old fashioned. There's a lot of people out there who won't know what shoehorn is, but my dad had one. And I think it's a really good maxim for writing. Don't try and shoehorn anything into your plot or your characters just because you want it there if it doesn't fit. Because I think that's your subconscious saying, that's not right. You know, it's just not going to work. For whatever reason, and it might change your whole story, but I would listen to that voice, that inner voice. In life in general, let's face it, we need to listen to that inner voice, don't we, to stop doing stupid things. But also in writing, that inner voice is really important, and I think it will guide you and it will tell you where your characters are going to go. And don't try and be too prescriptive about your characters. You know, allow your subconscious to say, actually, you know, they're really into this, but they're also into this other random thing, which is very different, but that's fine because people are full of contradictions, you know. And I think the worst characters are ones that are very sort of, you know, they're just, or they're a cliche. They've got, you know, they're just like other characters from other fiction. rather than being a real person that feels like they could step off the page, you know, and has these quirks that nobody else has, you know. But how you do that, it's really hard to quantify, except to say to listen to your subconscious, because I think your subconscious will know. And sometimes as you're writing, these things will come out. You know, I wouldn't worry too much if it's not coming to you. You know, if you're trying to sit there and write a hot seating or whatever it is you're doing with your character, and they're just not talking to you, they may not be in the mood to talk to you that day. That's fine, you know, because they are real and they do exist. And they also do things that you don't want them to do. I don't know if any of you have found this. You know, because in The Visitors, Liza and Caleb, spoiler alert, were going to go off together at the end. So without spoiling it too much, that changes. But in the original plan, that's what was going to happen. But they were just like, no, you know, that's not going to happen. And Caleb went off and fell in love with someone else. And so I had to change the story to fit what he had done. I know that sounds ridiculous because, like, who's in charge here? You know, like, but your subconscious is in charge. And my subconscious knew that was a better story. That Liza and, you know, Caleb weren't really right for each other for lots of reasons. And really, she needed to go off and make her own life and not follow this guy around. You know, so I just think you need to listen a lot. I don't know if that's any help, though. You know,
I'm happy with that answer, because the more I write through the book, the more it feels almost liberating. So it just kind of, oh God, I've just done a whole nother chapter. And it's not effortless by any means, but it feels right, sort of somehow. I don't know. I can't really explain it. So
no, exactly.
That's good. Thank you.
Go with it. Absolutely.
Brilliant.
That'll be your subconscious in charge. And I think as much as possible with writing, you should let your subconscious be in charge.
Yeah, great.
That's
Thank you,
Becca. Can we just finish up with one last question, which will be Dale's question?
Yeah, I was going to say that we must have Dale's question.
Well, actually, I think you have answered my question.
Okay.
But just in listening to you, because, you know, you're constantly saying, listen to your subconscious, and it's going to take you down a certain path. I've been sitting, letting this idea, this book, invade my brain and cause chaos. But what I ended up doing was I bought a book called Earth Medicine, and it's all about, you know, shamanism and discovering yourself and stuff like that. And then I went and bought a deck of cards called Medicine Cards. Because it kind of was something I was interested in, but something was saying to me, you need to pull a card a day, read what the totem animal is. And I've got the other book sat in because I journal at night. And I'm sitting reading it and making notes, but my brain is going all over the place. And so the fact that you said, let your subconscious do whatever, and do your research, and then your story will come in it. I'm sitting there going, I think my question's answered. But my question was, you know, if you've ever started writing something and then gone, oh my God, I can't write that, I've got to ditch it. How do you get back into, oh my God, where do I get my next idea, and how do I?
It's not happened to me that I've had to ditch a whole story as much as maybe an element of a story.
Right.
You know, that I've kind of felt like I really wanted this character to go and do this thing because it's interesting. But actually it's just I'm not going to have time quite often in the narrative to fit this part into the story. It's quite often like that. It ends up being a cul-de-sac, you know, in the story rather than part of the main journey, like a side quest, you know, that I haven't got room for because I've only got 100,000 words. I know that sounds like a lot, but when you've got, you know, a story to tell, that runs out quite quickly. So sometimes I have had to ditch elements of a story, and sometimes that's happened after writing, sometimes before. So especially when I was a newer writer, if you like, the first draft of Seamstress of Warsaw had a massive section at the beginning that was set during the Battle of Britain. So it was sort of summer 1940. I loved the Battle of Britain. I was so fascinated by it. I had my character, who was a kind of trainee journalist, was going around interviewing pilots and watching the dogfights, you know, over the channel, and it was all jolly good stuff, you know. And then, you know, about 30,000 words later, he decides, you know, to start the story. I remember someone reading it saying, what's all this stuff at the beginning about the Battle of Britain? It's completely irrelevant. And I'm like, yeah, but it's great. And they're like, no, it should start at chapter 7 or whatever it was. And I had to cut 30,000 words, which was a real harsh lesson. But I absolutely knew as I was writing it that it was sort of, you know, I was being self-indulgent, you know. I was just, I like this, so I'm going to talk about it. You know, like we said about the historical research thing earlier, if it's just there because you like it and you've done a lot of work on it and you want to show, look at everything that I know about the Battle of Britain, I'm so clever, you know, then your reader's not going to like that. You know, your reader's like, who are these people? Why are we interested in them? Where are they going? What is their quest? You know, what do they want? What don't they want? And who's going to get in their way? That's what readers are asking, really, without realizing it. And that's why they get frustrated, you know, with a book that goes off on some tangent. So I think it's more about interrogating yourself once you start planning out a story as to, does this serve the plot? You know, I'm a real plotter. Personally, I feel the best stories have a very clear plot. Just the other day, was rewatching the whole of the Star Wars saga from beginning to end. I'm a big Star Wars fan. And I was born in 1971, so I went to see the first Star Wars movie when I was 6 or 7 years old. And so I grew up with what is actually part 4, 5, and 6 of a 9-part series. Then 20 years later, George Lucas came along and made number 1, 2, 3. And a lot of people my age were like, what a pile of shit. What is this? This is not like episode 4, 5, and 6. This is awful. And I was trying to explain to my partner, who was from a slightly different generation, I was trying to explain to him why a lot of people my age hate those first 3 movies. And a lot of it, I really realized as I was talking about it, that the 4, 5, and 6 are a very simple story. They're just about this young guy who is set on a path to adventure. He has to save a princess. That's all he's interested in, really. And then all of the rest of the story comes out of that. It's just a very simple hero's journey, quest narrative. He has to go and save a princess, and along the way, he, you know, gets involved in this huge conflict and finds out this guy's his dad, and oh my goodness, and you know, he has this destiny he didn't know about, and so it goes off. But the actual story is incredibly straightforward. You go to, you know, episodes 1, 2, and 3, and it's all about politics and the Senate and this and that, and it's got all these different characters, and it's just like, oh goodness. And to me, that is boring, because I love the simplicity of the first 3 movies. So to me, a plot, it's really nice what Gina said about the Wild Air, because I've always felt like the Wild Air got a bit too complicated for its own good. So maybe I'm wrong about that. So I'm really glad to hear that, Gina, that you felt it was quite simple as a story. And really, I feel the best stories are quite straightforward. There's a thing in the movie business and in publishing called the elevator pitch. Have you heard of that? So, you know, you've got to sum up your whole story in like 1 line. It's really hard to do, but I would argue that if you can't do that, there might be a problem. You know, you still need to be able to, as complex as your story could be, you know, Lord of the Rings, you know, massive trilogy, loads of characters, loads of side quests, loads of complex machinations of everything going on. But at its heart, it's about, you know, good versus evil. It's about these fellowship of people who go on a quest to destroy the ring. That's what it's about. You can say it in 1 line. But it doesn't have to be an adventure story. You know, Eat, Pray, Love. Woman goes, you know, abroad and discovers herself. You know, it's just Jaws. You know, Jaws is a great movie. It's about conflict. It's a siege narrative. It's about family. It's about friendship. It's about being a man. It's about the war. You know, it's about all these different things. But at heart, it's a monster movie. You know, it's a monster attacking a community. So can you boil down your story into 1 line If you can't, I think you need to do a bit more work, you know, to simplify it down to one line. And you could think of it, especially if you come from an academic background, think of it like your thesis. You know, that is one way to think of it. What is the thesis of your story? What is it really about? What is it trying to say about life and universe and everything? You know, every story, as trivial as it might seem to be, is about something. So, you know, rom-coms are universally derided, you know, for being shallow entertainment. I've just written one, and let me tell you, now I had to think about it just as hard as I've thought about any other story I've ever written. What is it about? You know, it's about a woman in her 50s discovering herself after years of a bad marriage. That's what it's about. On the surface, it's about dating, but it starts off, and I kind of put the thesis on the first page. And the thesis is, there's this bit in When Harry Met Sally where it says, when you meet the person you want to spend the rest of your life with, you want that the rest of your life to start straight away. And she realizes that the person she wants to spend the rest of her life with is herself, and she doesn't know her. And that's what the book's all about. So I kind of put my thesis right there on page 1. And I feel like if you can't do that, then you need to do a bit more planning and plotting to work out, what are you trying to say? What is your story at heart really about? And it's not about the setting, it's not the fact that it's set in 1940 or whatever. It's about the character, the main character. What is at the heart of their quest? What is it that they want? What is it that they're trying to achieve? And I think you should absolutely be open to your brain going off in 100 different directions and reading all this stuff and writing loads of stuff down. But at some point, you've got to sit down and start writing, and you've got to decide what your tale is going to be about. Now, loads of different writers do that in different ways. I'm a real planner, but there are more people I've found in my experience who are not. I've actually met very few planners in my career, and I've met and talked to many, many writers. Most writers I know are not as planny as I am. That's not even a word, but you know what I mean. They're pantsers, as they call it. Planners and pantsers is an old word for it. I think there's a more PC way of saying that now, but I can't remember what it is. But people who, you know, just fly by the seat of their pants, they kind of maybe write the first 20,000-30,000 words, see where they get to, and then maybe take stock and plan from then on. I've known, you know, a writer friend of mine does it that way. Other writers literally will just write and write and write and see where the story takes them. And if that's you, then do it that way. You know, there really are very few rules in writing. And there's a lot of people who will tell you a lot of nonsense about, you can't do this and you can't do that. So really, like, who are you? Like the writing police, you know what I mean? Let's just do it how it feels natural, how it feels good. And you'll get there in the end if you've got the perseverance. That's probably the thing that every writer needs, is perseverance, because this business is not easy. You know, I won't lie to you, it's very hard to make a living, and so you've got to want to tell those stories, and you've got to want to take a lot of rejection, which is we've all got to deal with, and let your story shine through. And then you finish that one and you get on with the next one. And that's the job.
Well, that's an absolutely brilliant way to end. Rebecca, thank you so much. It's been a really, I think, you know, we've all had our questions answered, had a really, really intriguing and interesting evening. So thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
And you know, you're just so good at talking about your craft and
well, I hope so. I feel like I go on a bit too long, but I'm just trying to, it's so hard to quantify some of this stuff, because especially when you've been doing it a while,
yeah,
it's quite hard to sort of say, how do I do this? You know, because a lot of it becomes second nature. But I do remember the days of starting out, and so I do remember a lot of the things that I used to worry about. And I think writers worry far too much. We're just worry monsters, you know, we're full of anxiety. So you know, you're not alone. Meet other writers, talk to other writers. That's the thing that social media is brilliant for. You know, most of the writer friends I've made have been through Twitter and Facebook and so forth. And you know, talk to other writers, and you'll find that we're all, you know, worried about what we're doing, but you just got to keep going.
Okay, that's brilliant. So if you look in the chat now, Becca, you can see that
lovely.
yeah, it has been fascinating and really interesting. So thank you so much again, and yeah, all the best. I can't wait for the rom-com to come out.
Good, I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, I'm sure I will. Okay, thank you, and thank you all for your questions as well. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.